You absolutely cannot talk about the sound of modern metal without talking about nu metal. You may have noticed a vibe shift around nu metal around 2020. Nu metal used to be a dirty word. Critics loved to hate it, and purists blamed it for killing real metal in the 1990s. It's the sound of cornrows, parachute pants, wallet chains, and zero guitar solos. But that's not really true anymore. These days, so many more people either love or at least appreciate nu metal because they realize that it's so much more than just Jenkos and goatees. If you ignore the fashion and the hype for just a second and take a look at what was actually happening in the studio, you'll realize that you're looking at the direct origins of many modern metal subgenres. The production techniques that nu metal bands and their producers were forced to develop out of sheer necessity became the exact techniques that define the sound of deathcore, gent, and modern metalcore. Nu metal was essentially reinventing the fundamentals of how heavy music was engineered to deal with low-tuned guitars, cracked snares, good cop, bad cop vocals, and so on.
I get it, you're the asshole cop.
Yeah! Wait, what?
And today we're going to break down the specific production DNA that it left behind. The good, the bad, and the eternally clanky. For those who don't know me, I'm Eyal Levi, CEO of URM Academy. I've been a producer and a guitarist in my band Doth since 1999, and I've been playing way longer than that. And I have to be completely honest with you, by the late 90s, I had almost completely given up on metal. I was actually studying orchestral music. The bands that I grew up loving, like Pantera, Morbid Angel, Megadeth, I felt like they had either reached their peak or were going in directions that I just wasn't into. Death and black metal, which I absolutely love, had gone extremely underground. The landscape was grim. When Korn first hit in 1994, I remember reading about them in underground magazines right next to the death metal bands. The packaging wasn't in its own separate lane yet, but there was something different about it, and it felt like a shock to the extreme scene, much like Nirvana was a shock to the glam scene a few years earlier. I actually liked what I heard from Korn, but anytime that an artist does something unique and has success with it, inevitably there's going to be a movement formed around it. And in this case, it was called nu metal, and I fucking hated it. It just wasn't what I considered metal. It was too simple, there were too many hip-hop and rap influences, and worst of all, zero guitar solos. One of my most treasured memories from that era was how uncool it felt to actually want to be good at your instrument. I'm being sarcastic if you can't tell. You would actually get made fun of if you cared about getting better at your instrument. So I ignored it. I ignored Limp Bizkit, I ignored Seven Dust, and I ignored this band from Iowa called Slipknot. I figured it was just more of the same nu metal bullshit. But at the time, I was really going down the rabbit hole with orchestral music, and I felt like I was getting out of touch, and I felt like I should at least know what's going on in the mainstream, so I didn't become one of those stuck in the past guys. By learning some riffs by some of these bands, at least I could keep my skills current. So I went out and bought the self-titled Slipknot record, fully expecting to hate every second of it. And then the intro to Sick came on. My mind was fucking blown. It was so intense, so heavy, so chaotic, so much frenetic energy, and the moment where the double bass kicks in, just chef's kiss. That was what I had been missing from metal. The CD stayed in my CD player for about 6 months straight. That album resurrected my love and passion for heavy music. But later I realized that Slipknot did something brilliant. They took all these fence-sitting kids, kids that might have been into heavier, more groove-based music, but definitely not extreme music, took them by the hand and walked them right to the deep end. They would take true metal bands on tour, including Slayer, and brought that entire world into arenas. And for a lot of people, that was the bridge from radio heavy to extreme metal. What I also realized as a producer was that Korn, Slipknot, Deftones, they weren't just creating a new style, they were solving new production problems. And those solutions that they found became the standard techniques for the next 25 years of heavy metal production. And speaking of metal production, this video is brought to you by Nail the Mix. If you want to learn how to mix and master metal, Nail the Mix is the place to do it, straight from the best. Mixers like Will Putney, Buster Odeholm, Jens Bogren, Nolly, TLA, David Bendeth, and artists such as Gojira, Meshuggah, Periphery, Opeth, Nickelback, and over 100 more. At the start of the month, we released the raw multi-tracks from the session so you can download them straight into your DAW and mix the song from scratch. Getting your hands on this kind of source material is an incredible learning opportunity, just so you can see what the standard really is like at this level. Then, at the end of the month, the mixer does a live stream where they break down exactly how they mixed it on the record and answers your questions live. You can also join our monthly mixing competition. Submit your mix, vote for your favorites, and win prizes like microphones, guitars, plugins, gear, and a lot more cool stuff. And your membership comes packed with extras. All the URM plugins, MixLab with over 150 tutorials, Riff Hard for guitarists, and access to our private community on Discord and Facebook. So if you're serious about leveling up your mixes and learning from the very best, check out nailthemix.com today. It's at the link in the description of this video. Now, to understand why nu metal sounded the way it did, you have to understand what was going on in studios in the mid to late 1990s. It was the perfect storm of technological and cultural shifts. First, you had the transition from analog to digital. We were at the dawn of the DAW. Early versions of Pro Tools were starting to take over, moving workflows off of 2-inch tape and onto a computer screen. This was a fundamental workflow change. For the first time ever, you could edit, quantize, copy, and paste performances with surgical precision. This made achieving perfect consistency, something demanded by labels, fans, radio, and MTV, not just possible, but expected. This is where the modern grid mentality started to take hold. Second, you had the loudness wars. This was the era where every producer and mastering engineer was smashing their mixes with compressors and limiters to be the absolute loudest track on a CD. Nu metal, with its aggressive, in-your-face and dynamically crushed sound, was a key combatant in this war. Third, grunge killed the absolutely massive 1980s recording budgets. Now, by today's standards, they were still pretty big in the 90s, don't get me wrong, but not as big. Studios had to get bigger sounds faster and cheaper. This led directly to the rise of amp sims. Remember the Line 6 pod, the little red bean? That was a game changer. It made high gain, saturated, and scoop sounds accessible to absolutely everyone and became a staple for demos and even final album tracks. This new environment with digital editing, aggressive compression, and accessible high gain was the lab where the nu metal sound and beyond were born. In the 80s, the production challenge was managing high-pitched guitars and vocals. However, for nu metal, it was the exact opposite problem. How do you manage a sound that's all low end, all rhythm, and all aggression without it turning into a giant pile of mud? They needed new solutions, and while they weren't necessarily the ones who invented these techniques, they're the ones who took them from niche applications into the mainstream of heavy music production. The most obvious one is using 7-string guitars. Now, to be clear, Korn did not invent this. Steve Vai was using the Ibanez Universe back in the late 1980s as a tool for expanded melodic range. Korn's innovation was taking this prog shred tool and using it for pure brute force rhythmic heaviness. Also, they tuned that low beat down a whole step to A standard. This was inspired, as the band members themselves have said, by the slow, crushingly heavy and solo-free parts of Florida death metal bands like Morbid Angel. This created a massive engineering problem. A low A string on a guitar has a fundamental around 55 Hz, but most of its audible power lives in the low mid-range, roughly 150 to 500 Hz. If you've ever mixed low-tuned guitars, you know that's the mud region. It's the same range where the body of the bass guitar and the thump of the kick drum sit, and when those layers stack up, you get an undefined chaotic mess. The solution? Well, you guessed it, the iconic scoop mid-tone. Producers didn't just scoop the mids because it sounded fucking brutal. It was actually functional. It was a crucial engineering move. By surgically carving out low mid space, producers could make room for the kick fundamental and the bass guitar to occupy that region without masking each other, all while keeping the upper mids for pick attack. It was part of a whole system of high-pass filtering and balancing. This allowed for the mix to be both punishingly heavy and surprisingly clean. We kind of laugh at extremely scoop tone now, but it was a necessary solution. And modern production learned from it. We have corrected since. Gent and Thal, and even some modern death metal, are still all about those low-tuned 7, 8, or even 9-string guitars, but instead of a giant scoop, we now use more surgical targeted cuts in the low mids. We keep the upper mids for attack and definition though. It's the same problem, just a more refined solution. And Korn didn't just tune low, they treated their guitars like avant-garde noisemakers. They were using all kinds of non-traditional guitar noises and effects to fill the space where 80s style solos or guitar fills would have gone. Think of the intro to Here to Stay, where they used an additional octave shift on top of an already super low guitar. That sounds so fucking sick. The next major shift was the way that bass guitar was treated. It was no longer just a foundational instrument playing root notes, it became a lead percussive voice. Korn's bassist Fieldy was the primary architect here. His sound was a very specific recipe. Fresh, bright-sounding round-wound strings, an incredibly low action that caused the strings to aggressively slap against the frets and pickups, and a heavy slap and pop playing style. Then, wouldn't you guess it, he EQ'd out all the mids, leaving only the sub-bass and that iconic clank sound we all know him for. He literally said he wanted it to be an almost percussion-sounding instrument in order to cut through the wall of 7-string guitars. Now, Mudvayne took that idea and refined it. Ryan Martineau kept the aggressive attack and percussive slap, but added harmonic depth and dynamic control. His tone on Dig is a perfect example of how the clank approach could be both musical and articulate. It's still rhythmic and metallic, but with more note definition and melodic movement. To capture this wild sound in the studio, producers mainstreamed this idea that we now call the split bass technique. It's where you have a tightly controlled sub-channel and then a mid-range channel that's usually distorted. And by the way, it's kind of become industry standard for heavy music production. Here's how it works. Number 1, you take the clean DI signal from the bass and duplicate it onto 2 tracks. 2, on track 1, which is the lower the sub, you heavily compress or limit this track to make it perfectly consistent. I mean, super limited. Then you use a low-pass filter to cut off everything above approximately 200 to 250 hertz. This gives you a pure foundational rumble that locks in with the kick drum. 3, track 2, which is the grit or the clank, you high pass this track at the same frequency to avoid phase issues. Then you run it through a distortion plugin or amp sim. Like SansAmp was the classic choice for getting that mid-range grind. This creates all the aggressive, clanky, and audible character. When you blend these 2 tracks together, you get the best of both worlds. An unwavering low-end foundation from the low track, and a clear, aggressive, defined tone from the grit track that can slice right through the guitars. Now again, nu metal did not invent this. Producers like Terry Date were already using split bass techniques with Pantera years earlier. However, nu metal's extreme sonic needs took this trick and refined it. Now it's an essential part of the modern metal mixing playbook. Alright, we gotta talk about drums. The very heart of nu metal was its rhythm. The drumming was often inspired more by the syncopated deep pockets of funk and the powerful backbeats of hip-hop, more so than by high-speed blasts of extreme metal, with the exception of Slipknot. Think of David Silveria from Korn or John Otto from Limp Bizkit. It was all about feel and bounce. But to make those grooves hit with maximum impact and compete in the loudness wars, producers started to rely on really heavy sample reinforcement. Now, this wasn't a new idea. Industrial bands like Ministry and Nine Inch Nails, or the entire death metal scene, had been using triggers and samples for years. But nu metal is what brought this technique into mainstream rock production and made it the norm for radio-ready consistency and punch in heavy music. Here's why. The acoustic kick drum was blended with a sample that had a sharp, defined click in the 2 to 5 kilohertz range. This was the only way that it could be heard against the wall of low-tuned 7-string guitars and that clanky bass. The snare was blended with a sample or fully replaced to give it extra crack and pop, ensuring it was perfectly, almost unnaturally consistent with every single hit. This combo of hip-hop grooves and sample-reinforced, clicky, punchy drums became a key influence on the modern metalcore and deathcore drum sound. This production over performance mindset normalized the editing, quantizing, and sample replacement that's now commonplace. When you hear a Lorna Shore track today with those machine gun flawless kicks and snares, you're hearing the workflow that nu metal normalized, now taken to its logical, brutal conclusion. And let's not forget the breakdown. The modern breakdown really inherits 2 bloodlines. One comes from the thrash-style halftime crush parts, like think Raining Blood. The other comes from the jump-focused pogo riffs of nu metal. The breakdown, as we know it today, lives right in that intersection. Listen to this Seven Dust riff and try to tell me that this isn't the forefather of the modern breakdown. That's pure movement, and it's designed for bodies to react more so than heads to bang. You can trace that same energy straight into Linkin Park's One Step Closer. That That bridge is basically the modern template. Simple, massive, and built for an audience to explode on cue. It's the exact DNA that metalcore and deathcore breakdowns later refined and weaponized. You also had bands like Limp Bizkit, Slipknot, and Linkin Park fully integrating a DJ as a core band member. And this wasn't just a gimmick. For lots of bands, this was a legit textural and rhythmic tool. DJs like DJ Lethal and Sid Wilson used turntablism, like scratching, as another percussive instrument, creating rhythmic patterns that locked in with the riffs and the drums.
I am not ashamed. What is vital is an ocean.
Linkin Park took that idea and fused it with full electronic production. Joe Hahn and Mike Shinoda built songs around sequence loops, samples, and programmed hits that moved with the same precision as the guitar and drums. That sampled string loop locked perfectly with the drums and basically created its own riff. It showed how electronic elements could drive songs rather than just decorate them. This blew the doors wide open for the heavy use of electronics in metal. The atmospheric synths, programmed ambience, and glitchy effects you hear all over modern metalcore, from Bring Me the Horizon and Code Orange to Spirit Box and Sleep Token, are the direct descendants of this experimental spirit. This blueprint was put into action by a handful of key producers which defined the era. First, you have Ross Robinson, the godfather of nu metal. His genius was almost anti-production. He wasn't so much an engineer, he was more of a psychological catalyst. His goal was to capture raw, authentic, and often painful emotional performances from the artists. On Korn's self-titled debut, he had the band record most of the album standing in the same room playing simultaneously in order to capture their energy. And he famously kept the tape rolling at almost all times. One of the prime examples, which he and the band have talked about publicly, is the song Daddy. The track ends with several minutes of Jonathan Davis having a complete emotional breakdown and sobbing in the vocal booth.
You fucking ruined my life. You wanted to die.
It's really ballsy that they left that on the record. And he did the same thing with Slipknot. He pushed them to their absolute physical and emotional limits to capture the pure chaotic hatred on both the self-titled and Iowa records which he produced.
Ross Robinson made that clear to me. He's like, we're in the studio and I'm sitting there, like, just playing everything clean. You know, he's like, I don't feel shit. He's like, that's great, that's neat, you practiced. Okay, so, like, hit me with that shit. He's like, when I go see you play live, it's real. Like, I feel it. He's like, now you're just playing notes because you practiced a bunch. That's cool.
Then you had producers like Terry Date. He was more of a polisher. He'd already done Pantera and the Deftones, and he knew how to make heavy music sound massive, punchy, and clear. His work on Deftones' 1997 album, Around the Fur, is a perfect example of this. He took this band that was really raw and atmospheric and gave them this huge, expansive, and articulate sound without losing any of the chaotic energy. He brought that same polish meets power approach to Limp Bizkit's Significant Other, which he produced with the band and DJ Premier, and that album debuted at #1 and sold over 643 copies in the first week. Fucking insane. He made that thing a radio-ready monster. And of course, you can't forget mixers like Andy Wallace, known for mixing Korn's Untouchables, Slipknot's Iowa, and about a million other amazing records. One of those in particular was System of a Down's 2001 massive album Toxicity, which was, by the way, produced by Rick Rubin.
Here you go, create another table. You wanted to. Grab a brush and put a little makeup. You wanted to. Undiscuss the painter with the shake-up. You wanted to. Why'd you leave the keys up on the table? You wanted to.
Toxicity was a masterpiece of controlled chaos. It went multi-platinum, and Wallace's mix was a huge part of its success. He somehow balanced the band's wild, dynamic mood swings from frantic, aggressive parts to acoustic sections and somehow blended it into a cohesive, punchy, and radio-dominating sound. Wallace was a master of that hyper-compressed, no-dynamics, all-impact sound that defined the loudness war. His mixes were incredibly powerful and clean, and he knew how to make these incredibly aggressive and strange bands sound massive on mainstream radio. These guys wrote the playbook. They proved that you could be emotionally raw, sonically adventurous, and commercially massive all at the same time. So when you look at the modern metal landscape today, nu metal's influence is everywhere. It's easy to lump nu metal together into one sound, but anybody with functioning ears knows that Korn, Slipknot, Seven Dust, Deftones, Linkin Park, Mudvayne, they sound nothing alike. Their common thread was production priorities, not a single sonic template. Let's list the dominant traits, the stuff that we kept. First of all, extended range guitars. The 7-string is now standard. 8 strings are common in gent and deathcore, and this is 100% because nu metal normalized it. The split bass technique. This approach is the industry standard for modern heavy bass. We've had countless guests on Nail the Mix show their version of this. It's the standard. Sample reinforced drums. Again, this is the default in most modern heavy productions. The breakdown. The pogo riff or jump riff from nu metal evolved directly into the modern metalcore breakdown. Electronic and atmospheric layers. This is now a huge part of the sound for bands like Spiritbox, Humanity's Last Breath, Sleep Token, and Bring Me the Horizon, among tens of thousands of others. Emotional honesty. This is a big one. Nu metal shifted metal's lyrical focus from fantasy and politics to raw personal trauma and pain. That's the entire lyrical playbook for most of modern metalcore. Now the recessive trends, the stuff that we left behind. The no solos rule, and thank God this one died. There was a very real cultural pressure that made technical playing feel uncool for a bit. I don't believe in solos for their own sake, but that pressure was weird. Thankfully it passed, and even Slipknot brought shred solos back by their second album. The extreme mid-scoop. That super hollow wasp in a can guitar tone sounds very dated. We still cut mids, but we're much smarter about it now. The extreme clanky bass tone. We kept the technique, split bass that I've mentioned many times, but that specific trebly, clicky-clacky tone is a relic. The cheesy rap rock flows. The fusion of genres stuck, but some of those specific, simplistic rap cadences of the era are what sound the most dated today. And the fashion. Let's just agree to leave the cornrows, visors, and Jenkos in the past. And here's something to realize that's really important. Nu metal and the movement that came after it, the new wave of American heavy metal, were not enemies. They were a complementary, two-pronged attack that revitalized heavy music. Think about it. Nu metal was like the mainstream battering ram. It used hip-hop, funk, and groove to make heavy, aggressive music commercially huge again. It broke down genre walls and brought millions of new young fans into the ecosystem. The new wave of American heavy metal, bands like Killswitch Engage, Lamb of God, Shadows Fall, that was the correction. It captured that massive new audience that nu metal had built, but gave them the traditional metal elements that they were now craving. Thrash riffs, complex instrumentation, melodic death metal hooks, and of course, guitar solos. But here's the crucial part. The new wave of American heavy metal did not go back to 1980s production techniques. They built their sound on the modern foundation that nu metal had established. Low tunings, high gain saturated amps, and powerful, clear sample reinforced drum production.
This distance.
The new wave of American heavy metal took the modern engineering of nu metal and just applied metal songwriting on top of it. Together, these two movements pulled metal out of its 1990s crisis and set the stage for the next 2 decades of heavy music. So love it or hate it, nu metal's legacy is not the rapping. It's the groove, it's the arrangements, and of course, the engineering. It forced producers to confront a whole new set of low-end and rhythmic problems, and the solutions they found are the same ones that we still use every single day. I want to know what you think. What's the most important production technique that nu metal mainstreamed? Was it the popularization of extended range guitars, split bass technique, heavily sample reinforced drums, electronics? What do you think? Let me know down in the comments. As always, like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.